You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with political commentator Polly Mackenzie and John Stevens, deputy political editor of the Daily Mail. They'll be with us from now right up until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Putin's pawns, that's how the Metro describes the two British men fighting for Ukraine who've been captured and sentenced to death by the Russians. The Eye reports that the court proceedings have been condemned as nothing more than a show trial, which has sparked a diplomatic outcry. The Telegraph pictures the two men in their courtroom cage under the headline, "Captured British Fighters Sentenced to Death." This is the Daily Mirror on that story, sentenced to death by Putin. While the Mail says the UK is outraged at the sentence. The Guardian leads with the fuel cost crisis, reporting that low-paid care workers can't now afford the petrol they need to get to work. On the railways, The Times reports that strike chaos is set to worsen as train drivers join the stoppages. The Financial Times reports that Chancellor Rishi Sunak has been accused by a leading economic research body of squandering £11 billion in taxpayers' money by paying too much interest on government debt. While The Sun pictures Prince William selling the big issue, as the paper puts it, just like Mum Diana. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by political commentator Polly Mackenzie and John Stevens, deputy political editor of the Daily Mail. Welcome to you both. Good to see you. Let's start with the Metro and their front page. The headline there, as we ran through the newspaper stack, Putin's pawns. Polly.
Well, the Foreign Secretary is quoted as saying that she is outraged by this death sentence. And I think that's how most of us will be feeling. Throughout this war, it's been clear that Putin, the Russians and their allies are not interested in following the laws of war. There have been allegations of all sorts of war crimes, including attacking civilians, the summary execution of civilians, of sexual assault and rape against women. And this is another example of that violation of the principles under which countries are supposed to remain to follow during times of war. And this Donetsk People's Republic is not a state recognized by anyone other than the Russians. Russia itself doesn't have the death penalty, but they, it seems, are endorsing this show trial, essentially, of these captured prisoners of war who ought to be treated like prisoners of war. But they're not being treated like prisoners of war. They're not interested in, as I say, in following the laws of war. And the only hope, in a way, as the Metro says, is that because they are Putin's pawns, because they are leverage against the West, of course, our Foreign Secretary will be extremely concerned about the future of these two British citizens, as will the Moroccan government be against about the fate of the Moroccan citizen. That potentially that means that this sentence won't be carried out swiftly because it will give them some leverage against us. I think that's all we can hope for at this point.
And John, the accusation is that they're mercenaries, but both men we know settled in the country way before the invasion.
Yeah, I think both of them went out to Ukraine in 2018. Aidan Aslin, who is from Newark in Nottinghamshire, he went out there to fight back then. And Sean Pinner, who is the guy who is from Watford, he actually moved out there with his wife in 2018, moved to Mariupol. He's a former British Army soldier and then started fighting at some point after the invasion, I think it was. And so Britain is saying quite clearly these aren't people who were mercenaries. And it does seem like this was a sham trial. Tom Tugendhat, who's chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, he was on the radio earlier today and was saying this is a complete sham trial. These weren't really judges. These were people dressing up as judges and pretending to be. As Polly says, they don't have the death sentence in Russia. And it seems quite possible that the only way that these guys manage to get out alive is if they are used as a prisoner swap, and that Putin uses them and says, well, we will hand these over if you release some Russians who are accused of war crimes in Ukraine.
Yeah, so we see them photograph pictured at the front of the Daily Telegraph, and there has been some mention that this is actually what it really is the start of negotiations, because there could be some sort of prisoner swap, as John's saying. Polly, do you think that is the likely outcome of this scenario?
I think it is. They will certainly be considering what leverage there is. Huge numbers of Russian soldiers have been captured by the Ukrainians, and they have been collecting evidence, as John suggests, for a range of war crimes trials, because they are following due process and collecting evidence and scrutinising that evidence. That means they are proceeding much more slowly. So it does seem that what the separatists in Donetsk, backed by Putin, are trying to do here is, in a way, get ahead of the curve, be first with their kind of criminal process, so that they can potentially negotiate the return of prisoners on the other side. It's important that we keep, even during a war, lines of diplomatic communication open to minimise the harm, to find ways to come to some sort of settlement or some way to end this war. And we absolutely have to hope that something like a prisoner swap is possible in order to protect the lives of these men who, essentially, having settled in Ukraine, were just like so many Ukrainian soldiers who we know have also been captured or transported to Russia, and we don't even know their fate, were just simply fighting to defend their homeland against a hostile invasion.
John, does it come as any surprise that the normal conventions of war, as they are not being followed at all in this situation?
Well, sadly not when it comes to Putin. We know that he's done so many things for propaganda purposes. We know that after they were captured, they were paraded on camera, which is obviously one of the things that you're not allowed to do under the Geneva Convention, is parade prisoners of war on camera. So obviously, it is shocking that Putin is breaking all of these conventions, but it's not really a surprise when you see what else he's been doing in Ukraine over the last few months and definitely years.
And Polly, what role do you think our government has to play?
Well, our government will be wanting to open lines of communication around these prisoners. We know how difficult it can be. We saw the years of negotiation it took to return Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe on, in a way, a much lesser charge, not threatened with a sentence of death from Iran. When you have a government which has, kind of geopolitical ambitions and is using prisoners simply as leverage, with no regard, frankly, for their humanity or their care, the reality is it can take an immensely long time. And what you don't want to be as a government is, in a way, just sort of creating incentives for the Russians or in any kind of situation for people to be taking hostages. The sense that if taking British citizens hostage, capturing them, is a way to get concessions from the United Kingdom government, that kind of creates a really problematic kind of message for the world. So they need to be really cautious about what is offered, and I think crucially remain in lockstep, as we have done with the Ukrainians. In the end, any end to this war, any negotiation over prisoner swaps will have to be led by Ukraine, because it's their country which has been invaded, and it's for them to determine the any kind of concessions that they're willing or not willing to make.
Yeah, but our government quite vocal. If you look at the Financial Times, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss quoted as saying, "The judgment's a sham. I utterly condemn the sentencing of Aden Aslin and Sean Pinner, held by Russian proxies in eastern Ukraine. They are prisoners of war. This is a sham judgment with absolutely no legitimacy." And that is the key, that the area that we're talking about, where they have been put on trial, isn't even recognised, John.
No, that's completely right. And I think you will see, obviously, ministers making this case to Russia. But I think it is important that the Ukrainian government takes the lead in this, because Obviously, we are saying that they aren't mercenaries. They are people who had moved to Ukraine and settled there. And so it was legitimate that they were fighting. I think the UK government has to tread a very difficult line when it comes to this.
Welcome back to you both. Let's have a look at the Daily Telegraph. And this story, it's Lord Frost who's saying that Boris Johnson will be ousted by autumn unless he changes course. And this is Lord Frost, the former Brexit minister and erstwhile, or still is, Boris Johnson ally. Polly, take us into this story, although it's very critical. It doesn't sound like an ally.
No, I mean, this is a classic of the Lord Frost political strategy, in that what he says is what Boris Johnson should do is stuff that makes him, Lord Frost, very happy. You know, and that's really all he's been saying for years, is that Boris Johnson should do the things that David Frost likes. And it's a reminder, I think, of what the fragility of Boris Johnson's position is pushing him into. Lord Frost represents absolutely an important wing of opinion within the Conservative Party, a sort of traditionalist Thatcherite, low tax, low regulation, the ones who wanted Brexit to be the unleashing of what they call Singapore on Thames. Just, you know, sort of let the markets rip and stop government doing quite so much. The problem is that that isn't actually what won Boris Johnson the 2019 general election and that amazing majority. It's not what he's been trying to deliver. It's not actually what will win him the next election, because the coalition of voters who supported Brexit is much more complicated. They don't want a low tax, low regulation economy. They want decent public service. They want infrastructure investment, and they want levelling up, all of which is quite expensive. But if Boris Johnson wants to shore up his position with the crucial voters who can control whether he's prime minister or not, those Conservative backbench MPs, he probably does have to do the stuff that makes David Frost happy. The problem is that undermines his prospects of actually being able to win an election, because it steers him massively to the right, to the appeal of the Conservative backbenches and grassroots, and away from those voters who actually put him into number 10.
John, Lord Frost is predicting an attempt to oust him after the Conservative Party conference in early October, unless he calls for tax rises to be reversed, VAT on energy bills to be slashed, and also he's calling for a 10-year Conservative plan for changing Britain. And he's not alone in wanting these things within the Conservative Party, is he?
No, and I think the comments that he's made shows that the political risk that Boris Johnson faces didn't go away after that vote on Monday. We know there's a lot of people in the Tory party who are calling for more tax cuts. We know that the tax burden in the UK is at, I think it's possibly now its highest level in 70 years. And you listen to Boris Johnson in that speech today. He was saying that a government can't spend its way out of inflation and it can't tax its way to growth. But that almost seems like what the government has been doing for the last 6 months, that you can see why Boris Johnson now is coming under pressure from people on his own side, people who want that cut in income tax that's been promised for 2024 to be brought forward to this year. And I think you're going to hear a lot more of this when it comes to the budget in the autumn. I think it is quite probable now that you see Boris Johnson doing something to help people with personal taxes. You've already seen him have to water down that rise in national insurance. They're raising the thresholds. I think it's later in this summer. And so, yeah, you're starting to see a bit of a mess on the tax policy side, that what the Tories are putting forward is starting to look rather incoherent.
Very quickly, Polly, I think we've got about 30 seconds. Take us into these smoking reforms that are potentially going to be coming in. This is in the Metro.
Well, the goal that the government's advisor, Javid Khan, has set out is to make smoking obsolete. One of the great things is there's loads of other ways to get nicotine, which is the addictive substance in cigarettes, but that does almost none of the health harms, that don't rely on burning tobacco and inhaling a whole bunch of smoke and tar into your lungs, which is the thing that kills you. And that means that we can move people away from smoking to alternatives like chewed tobacco or vaping, inhalators, all sorts of things. And so the idea is to make it so that some teenagers will never be able to buy cigarettes, because instead of just sticking at 18, it just goes up every single year.